Yes, so today we're talking about the respiration, right? So the respiration is obviously a very big subject. And this being big subject, we obviously touched upon it many times in one way or another, but still, that's kind of the question that deserves the periodic return and the accentuation of this particular thing, because fundamentally we are all like bound by this topic, so that eventually it's the conversation which is like really leads to the discussion about the most important and kind of vital function, right? So that we have, and without the respiration, we can't get very far, right? So it's like what we have as the time frame without the respiration is not much, to say the least, right? So that's really not a difficult thing to understand. And another thing that I wanted to address is obviously the point how the what are the sort of, let's say, classic perspective and the classic knowledge on the entire thing of the webinars, entire things of the webinars, on the entire thing about the respiration, right? Versus what the focus that we have, because we obviously look at it differently. We look at it from the perspective of the importance that exists from the respiration to the entire developmental process, right? So you see, that's really the key. It's not just the respiration alone, it's actually the whole thing, how the respiratory function being the leading element in the entire development and the formation. So because otherwise what we have is that today the main issue and the main problem of everything related to the discussion of respiration is the fact that it's being seen as something like separate. So the person eats separately, the person digests separately, and the person, most importantly, breathes separately from the other movements. So that's really the key, and that's really the biggest difference that we are talking about. So from that perspective, we want to move away from the sort of like this disconnected participation, because it's all based on the muscular centric way of looking at movement, and this muscle centric perspective with muscles as movers accentuates the point of the muscle strength. So, and indeed, if we compare, let's say, the muscle strength means that the actual like absolute contractile forces that the muscle can exert, let's say between the chest muscles, right? So like the deep intercostal muscles, and for example, even the superficial abdominal muscles, or let's say the muscles of the legs or the arms, right? So those would be much stronger. And that's really the key perspective that we want to start looking at and really transform, right? So that we are starting to look at the bigger picture, and we highlight at first point the connectivity, right? So the connectivity and the underlying kind of fascia bed which links everything, and how that total torso connectivity influences everything else. So that's kind of a preamble, right? So you see, but with this preamble, we also want to move to the next level, right? And then let's sort of do this in a proper sequence. So first we're going to start with just the basic recollection and say recognition. So in the first basic recollection and recognition of what is the respiratory function, right? So how does the respiratory function work? So for this purpose, I have pulled a number of pictures from the internet so that we can start with classics. Yes, visibility is all right?
All right.
Okay, good. Okay, so let's get the basics. So this is the illustration of the basic mechanics. Okay, so this is the one that shows you the state of the lungs, right? So now let's get the keyword. So before I move to the mechanics, let's get the keyword. I will even write it down here. So the keyword is the gas exchange. So you probably heard me using this expression multiple times, right? But it's worth kind of recalling it, right? So that the main thing here is the gas exchange. That's what happens. So in a simplistic version, we want the oxygen in, right, and the carbon dioxide out. So that's the basics of the gas exchange. Now, of course, there are some additional gases, but we'll kind of disregard them for the time being. So now, what is so important about the gas exchange? The gas exchange is the foundation of metabolism. So this is important to remember. So that's kind of the first thing that people often, forget or disregard when talking about, the respiratory and say digestive function in, let's say, in separation, because the moment the conversation goes into their some kind of metabolism, right? So the main conversation starts going around the nutrients, right? And most of you have probably gone through some kind of blood tests, which would be sort of showing sometimes it's a blood test, sometimes it's a urine test, right? So you see where you can get the huge line of different nutrients and like the micrograms and whatever, and it could be like 200 if it's a sophisticated lab test. And then everybody moves into this conversation. Okay, so we have to take this supplement or maybe this supplement. This is too high, this is too low. So the conversation goes in a disconnected way. However, the key thing that we want to remind ourselves is very, very simple. If we look at the sort of pyramid of importance, it's very straightforward. At the base of this pyramid is the gas exchange and respectively the gas flow, right? That's respiration. Then after that, you've got the liquid, right? So liquid exchange and respectively the way that it's integrated into the total flow. And that would be anything which kind of, it's sort of, you see, being included in digestion, but it's more the circulation rather than the digestion, right? And only the third level is the actual digestion with, the absorption of nutrients. So that would be the intake of the solids. So those are the famous nutrients. So this is the pyramid that you always have to keep in mind. And now, what's the next thing that we have to think about is the timeline, right? So what are the timelines? The timelines for the gas exchange, right, is that the average person can hold it, at maximum, let's say 1.5 minutes, but even if you just hold your breath for 30 seconds, you're already experiencing a certain level of discomfort, right? And the normal breathing is something around 10, 8 to 10 or say 12 breaths per minute. So it means that it happens every 5 to, let's say, 8 seconds. So that's very fast compared to your liquid intake, right? So you see, this is a different story. The maximum here that the person could be staying without hydration, right? So you see, it's somewhere, I don't remember the exact numbers, let's say 50 hours or something like this, right? Maybe more, but that's already, really dramatic. But let's say, anyway, it takes several, from, let's say, several hours to experience the thirst, right? So that's the next point. So here the scale goes into the low hours, right? Low hours, let's say high minutes. So if here we do on average 10 breaths per minute, so let's say the regular liquid intake would be something like whatever, once every 2 hours, sort of. So meaning that this is 10 per minute, this is 1 every 100 minutes, roughly. I'm just giving you the numbers so to understand that the respiration is sort of 1,000 times more urgent than the actual liquid exchange, right? And then if we move up to the nutrients, so this is where the person can stay without food for, maybe a week or more, whatever, right? So, and if you talk about being hungry and 3-4 times a day as the regular eating, so generally we can say that here we move from 100 minutes, we can safely say that we are moving to, let's say, 250 minutes, right? So you see 500 minutes. So this is something which is not critical, right? So you see, that means that here we move into a next range. So respiration is 1,000 to 10,000 times more urgent than anything else, and then the liquid exchange, or then the gas, or then the nutrients exchange. So that's something which is very important to keep in mind, like how many cycles are happening there. So that's why we have to see it through this lens when we are looking at the importance of the mechanics. So, and even though the strength parameters or the force, kind of the contractile force, might not be large, but frequency, urgency, importance, right? So you see, that's what happens. So meaning that the big story goes that everything that you do, your entire body, the first optimization that it has, it optimizes around the gas exchange. So what we're going to see here as the description of the mechanics of the gas exchange, that's kind of the ideal scenario, right? So because here you can see the diaphragm, contracting or the diaphragm relaxing. So this would be the main conversation, but we have to understand that if there is any deficit in the gas exchange, right? So you see, then you would be facing troubles. And we know that a very easy number, like after the COVID, everybody knows it, right? So you see like 96, 98% of the oxygen saturation, that would be some sort of a regular, reasonable mark, like a healthy mark for their, like as a parameter that indicates that the gas exchange is working well. So in other words, what do we have to see? that whoever, wherever, and so on, has to optimize this parameter first. So the entire body, all 600 whatever muscles and everything else, they are kind of as a backup reserves, ready to be mobilized in order to facilitate this respiration. And that's something which is very important before we even move into the technical details, right? So you see that, because what does it mean? We just made this pyramid. We made this pyramid when we were talking about the urgency and the frequency and the importance. So that means that the brain, or the body in the more global sense, doesn't have the perspective of the long-term future, right? It has to sort of perform, it has to live right now. And this life requires that gas exchange. So if this gas exchange doesn't happen with sufficient frequency, right? So you see that would be this anywhere from 8 sort of breaths per minute. And if it doesn't happen with the sufficient efficiency, so being able to maintain this respiratory, you know, the oxygen saturation as their kind of combined parameter, so everything else is going to be optimized towards. Means that all the other elements, they would start helping, right? Like the abdominal wall, this will start helping the respiration, even if that brings the conflict and reduces the quality of the digestion. So that's the important thing, but that would include everything: head positioning, arms positioning, like, you know, things that we all sort of worship and like to see, like fine motor skills and so on. In this pyramid of the basic metabolism, they are actually sitting very, very low. So if the arms are necessary to facilitate the respiration, they would be doing that. So the freedom of the arms only works within the, like, when they are not directly when those muscles are not directly recruited for the respiration, then they are free to service the actual function of the arms, right? But if not, they have to service the function, they have to service the respiration. So that's the basic, the most kind of fundamental understanding of the whole thing. Now, once we understood this, now let's go to the details. So as you can see here, that's the demonstration which shows you the lungs, right? And here you can see that when the person inhales, you know, this kind of filled up lungs, that's where everything goes in, right? So you see, and that's the relaxation. So when things go out, right? So you see, this is the oxygen in, this is the carbon dioxide out. And what you see here, if we move to another picture, which is going to explain it a little bit more powerfully. So here you have the story, right? You have the story which shows you what happens. It shows you that when you get into the inhalation, the key word here, the diaphragm contracts. So the dome of the diaphragm, from being higher, goes lower, right? So higher, lower. That's the big idea. And when you exhale, it relaxes and the dome goes up. So what else are you seeing here? Another big word here, rib cage expands, right? So as the rib muscles contract. That's the explanation. So the key word here is the rib cage expands. So that's a big point. And there is an invisible part here, which we have to keep in mind, right? So when somebody is saying that the rib cage expands, that implies that the invisible but obviously present part, the trachea, that the trachea itself stays still. So the rib cage expands not in some kind of open air. It expands and moves in respect to the inserted trachea. So that's a very important thing to understand. So the primary thing for this quality movement, quality expansion at the upper lobes of the lungs to happen is the presence of the two effects. Not only is the ability of the rib cage to expand, but it's actually the stability, intense, like immovable stability of the trachea. And that part you are not going to find in any textbooks, because any textbook is going to tell you that, well, the trachea is primarily made out of cartilage. So cartilage is like sort of material that doesn't contract or doesn't expand. So we can consider the trachea just as a sort of windpipe, as if you were doing this kind of tracheostomy, right? So it's like replacing it with the pipe and then making it breathe with the pipe. But that's the key point. Trachea is not a pipe. It's the living system, which actually, once you respect the fact that it's a living system, its stability means a lot. It's not easy to be stable. So stability is actually a surprise. When everything else is moving, what actually makes trachea to be stable? And then once we take the trachea into account, we take all the other elements, right? Because trachea itself is then connected further. It's obviously integrated with the mouth floor. It's parallel to the esophagus, and then you've got the whole deal. So that's already the very first observation gives us a number of things to think about. But before we move on, let's also accentuate the first point. You see, original position of the diaphragm is, when we look at it from the front, it's higher, right? So curvature is greater. Then as it contracts, it flattens. The curvature flattens. So from more curved to less curved. And when it relaxes, it's the opposite, right? So you see, then it goes from the smaller curve to the larger curve. Why is it important? Because as you can see here, there are several implied ideas. One idea, as you look at this arrow, is that as the diaphragm contracts from going from a higher dome to the lower dome, that means that it exerts some downwards pressure into the abdominal space, right? So you see, this is something that we talked about many times, that this intra-abdominal pressure becomes a stimulus for the development of the transversus abdominis, of the entire abdominal wall, and it reaches all the way down into the pelvis and the pelvic floor. And the second thing that we have to keep in mind is, of course, this same typical question that we always have to ask. Well, why the movement of the diaphragm is so clean? If we have it attached on two sides, right? So you see, if we have it attached like that, so then what actually holds it, right? So you see why that curve, that dome is going so cleanly. Because if the rib cage is not stable, then the natural tendency would be to expand. So for the ribs to be moved apart, right? So you see, that's another mechanism. You see, if the diaphragm itself is not very well connected or weak, so then pulling on the sides is also good enough to bring the diaphragm down. So this is, you see, the very first, the very first picture is already bringing a lot of the questions and thoughts over there. And this is the frontal view, which sort of shows you the same thing, right? So where you can just see those curvatures cleaner, and you can see those arrows cleaner, and now you get the other side of the arrows. So which also implies, right? So you see that the diaphragm should be able to return to this position. So which is not given by any means. So that's the first understanding. As we move further, we will ask the next set of questions, right? But maybe it's a good idea to plant ourselves back into one of our favorite images, right, of all times. So this cross-sectional image, right? So you see, because this cross-sectional image is putting this whole thing into the context. So this is, again, something we discussed before, that you can visualize that as the diaphragm contracts and brings itself lower, right? Or if you wish here, brings itself lower, so it brings up the intra-abdominal pressure, and it reaches all the way down to the expansion of the pelvis and the pelvic floor, right? And of course, it also impacts the way that the transversus abdominis or the entire abdominal wall is working, and then what happens with the expansion that goes backwards and how it stimulates the spine, right? And the same story here. If the chest expands, that expansion is not limited just to the sides or to the front. That expansion also leads and stimulates the actual spine. So that's the context that we also have to see. And again, the big point that we have to keep in mind, that in terms of length, like in terms of the actual distances traveled for the, say, dorsal expansion, is it going to be something large? No, it's not going to be large, right? But it's, anyway, it's clearly palpable, and it accounts for sort of several millimeters. But in terms of the tension, so the tension there is great, right? So in some areas, the tension, the strain, that's kind of the, the tension itself is lower. So those areas, they move more. But in some areas, like for instance, the abdomen can move more, right? Whilst in some areas, like the back, the dorsal one, it's the other way around. So the tension is greater, right? So tension is up, length is down. So that's this something to remember very, very clearly when you see those standard pictures, which you can observe and get them from the internet, right? So it's like, you just type respiratory system, you're going to get this, right? You type mechanics of the respiration, you're going to have the endless list of this kind of pictures. But you see that in those pictures, everybody just focuses on a simple mechanism. The diaphragm down, the ribs up, and then everything goes on. But how is that linked to the next, to the total integration, how it's linked to the neighbors? This conversation is never present. Why? Because when you look at the ordinary people, it's not so dramatically different, unless you really, if you just get a quick look. Once you start looking more diligently, of course, you will see a lot of differences. But, obviously, this is the difference that is the most obvious in the children with the cerebral palsy, right? With the children who experience the neurodevelopmental challenges at the early years. So why? Because they have to get this optimized gas exchange right from the start, right? And if it's not working very well, then we have the other thing. Now, once we understand that this is how the system works, then we have to also look at it from the other perspective. And let's look at it from the side. As we look at it from the side, what else we're going to see, right? So we saw it from the front. It's a kind of simpler line of the diaphragm, right? So it's just this, more curved dome or flatter dome. But when we start looking from the side, the things get trickier, right? So, because this is where you observe that the diaphragm itself has a certain plane of action. And the return of the diaphragm also has to have a certain plane of action. And when we talk about the plane of action for something which is curved, this is really, 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 really far from being straightforward, right? Because, like a slight change of the apex is going to make a big difference in the total plane, right? So slight changes of the apex, the total inclination is going to be completely different. So, and that refers both, to all things about the apex, shifting the apex slightly up or down, forwards or backwards, shifting the apex slightly higher, so more domey, or slightly lower, less domey, and also tilting the whole thing. So we are going to discuss those things when we will be looking at the pictures, right? Because that is essential for us to understand about the whole process. So these are the things which we clearly have to keep in mind, right? So, and again, here the chest expansion, here is the chest contraction. Now, once we are equipped with this, what are the next steps for us? So the next step for us is clear. When we look at the performance of your child, we have to ask this simple question. So this is a nice picture because it sort of does things in this kind of double way. So where you can observe it, it's well described. So it's kind of this projection of how it moves, right? So, and now ask yourself a question. These are the ribs number 1, 2, 3, right? So you see the first 3 ribs, they get the most of action. And the first 2 ribs, they're actually connected to the manubrium. Well, and then since the sternum moves here, you can sort of add the rib number 4 here as well. Ask yourself a question. In your children, in how many of them do you see this clean expansion of the upper 3 or 4 ribs? The answer would be very, 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 very few, and those who have it, these are milder children, right? So you see, when we talk about the child who is level 4 and level 5, and even level 3, this is where these upper portions, they don't show you this expansion. So things happen elsewhere. So that's why you can see right from the start that things are different from what the standard picture is drawing to us, right? So you see that this capacity is not there. Now, let's kind of think about it in a slightly bigger perspective. So let's imagine that we have a child who is born and has to breathe in order to survive, right? Because again, we have to remember this very important point. What happens in the very beginning of the life after, after birth? So prior to that, your child was in a very, very super friendly environment. Because when the child is in utero, you don't need to do all this work. Everything is done by the mother, not via you don't deal with kind of large gases. You just get with the minute kind of gas bubbles, which are present in the bloodstream of the mother. So it's the bloodstream of the mother which delivers both the oxygen and takes away the carbon dioxide. So from that perspective, it's a paradise. No work needed. Just everything comes in a nice liquid form and directly into a bloodstream. You don't need to do any efforts for the gas exchange, for the liquid exchange, and for the for the solid exchange. And then suddenly the person is born into extremely hostile environment, right? So you see, we are kind of taking Earth as our normal place, but just relive this experience. Suddenly, everything has been provided directly into the bloodstream, and with the constant pressure floating in the amniotic fluids, right? And then suddenly you are being exerted into this very unfriendly world, which has the atmospheric pressure pushing at you and trying to squash you, right? Which has the reaction force of which you kind of get squashed yourself. It also generates all sorts of this bending and bending moments and angular momentum. So you are in a very serious, challenging trouble. And the entire hope is that what you have formed during the early stages of life is strong enough to get you through it, in order to start providing you with the good gas exchange with that 96, 98% right from the start. And if it's not, what would happen? Well, quite obviously, your body would move into the extreme mobilization state. So the brain would mobilize everything: abdominal wall, the neck, the arms, whatever, everything. Try to find if the diaphragm doesn't deliver the good contraction, it will try to find the inventive ways of bringing it down by spreading the ribs, right? So that's what happens. The child gets into this early setting where everything gets optimized to service this necessary gas exchange, because as we understood, without the gas exchange, well, life stops. So that's the central thing. So when we would be looking at the examples of the children, we really have to see this perspective, right? So you see that this is the total thing which has to be optimized for their respiratory performance for keeping the gas exchange quality, never bringing it down. And of course, once that clock, right, and that's a kind of one of the primary clocks of life, that respiratory clock, once that clock is set, it's very difficult to reset it. Because, you know, imagine you were the brain, right? So you see, you have just optimized things in such a way, you know, even if it costed you the mobilization of the resources, and then suddenly you have to change this most intimate, most dangerous thing, because basically it's, you know, threatens the existence of the brain itself, because it's the largest kind of consumer of the oxygen, right? So that's the thing to keep in mind when we would be looking at the pictures. So with this, let's look at some pictures of how the things can possibly work, right? So I'm sharing, for example, the vision of this channel, right? So you see what you see here. This is a good example of the kid where everything moves as the way to facilitate the respiratory function. Everything moves, right? So you see, like whatever he does, he actually uses this kind of twists and turns and so on in order to facilitate the respiratory function. So he can't stop, he can't settle, and so on. Let's look at this example, right? So you see, when he's lying on his tummy, you know, things are in a continuous trouble for him, because now he has to breathe against his own weight. So he's optimizing everything for this, but you see the sliding shoulder blades, but what do you see, the chest expansion? No, you don't, right? So we look at this picture. Now you see the other part of the equation. You can see that the mouth floor, right? So you see, I can maybe zoom it in, right? You see that the mouth floor itself is far from given in being stable. So things float, things shift. So why? Because for her, if she cannot provide this gas exchange drive from the chest, from the upper chest itself, well, the system has the top and it has the bottom, which is the diaphragm below, right? So if this designated area is not able to do it, so she will try to do some sort of coordination and activation in order to get it throughout the entire thing. So that's the big thing. And that's the one of the greatest paradoxes. So when we look at the muscles of the trachea and their activity, this is very far from being a windpipe, because there are all sorts of embedded musculature, there are all sorts of embedded ligaments and so on. So that's how the whole thing is made. So when we look at it, we have to remember this very, very clearly, so that it's essential to have the proper stability at all levels, right? So you see, from the level of the jaw to the level of the hyoid bone to the level of the mouth floor, and then as it enters and traverses into the thoracic inlet and then goes further. So these are all being the essential conditions for the things to work. If that doesn't, you know, if you don't have those basics, things are in trouble, right? And then here we can see the example of the child who is desperately optimizing herself for the respiration, right? So what you're seeing here, you're obviously seeing that, you know, between the three parts, the trachea, the chest wall, and the abdomen, and then of course the pelvis, you would see this kind of sequences, so that these two, the abdominal wall and the neck, they work together, and then the chest and the pelvis, they work together. So it's a wave, and this wave is the one which is, you see, the important thing is to understand that when we look at this girl, you say, oh, gee, this is a severe condition. Why? Because she has all this kind of waves going through. But the fact is, in reality, we have to see the basis. She is showing us how difficult it is to breathe. Not just for her, but for all of us. So that we have the same mechanism behind it, but we have so many additional stabilizing factors that we can change and kind of convert this mechanism from the changes in length to just having it as the changes in tension. So that's the key point. So we need to do the same thing. But if she doesn't have tension, which stabilizes and creates the strong enough pull, right? So then she has to replace that background tension of the stabilizing tension of the fascia with the greater activity of the muscles, of the more superficial muscles and their mobilization. So that's the key thing to understand, that, you know, when we look at the children who are in severe condition, it's not about them being special. So us kind of being normal, and then her case being somehow abnormal, right? Or pathological. Not at all. Her case is normal. Why? Because that's good enough to provide for the gas exchange. And ours effectively has to be seen as supernormal, right? So you see, we are above that, right? So you see, meaning that we have to really appreciate that it's not just some kind of, okay, what's the big deal? You know, it works as this kind of, you know, what's the name of it? The thing that goes for the fireplace. Yes. So that's the thing. So that's why it just gives us a glimpse of how actually complex the respiratory function is. And if you look at her, you can see everything in her situation is being optimized for the respiration. Does her brain care about the function of the arms? Not at all, right? So the arms, they are kind of working as a replacement. If those upper levels of the ribs, they don't expand, well, then the brain would recruit the arms in a mobilizing fashion to provide at least some counter drag there, or some counter stabilizing capacity there, in order to create a selective, you know, dynamic isolation for the lungs. So if we were trying to work with her arms and try to give her toys or kind of tickle her hand, thinking that she needs to develop the fingers better, what we would be doing? We would be working against this tendency, right? So you see, the brain is saying, hey guys, I'm busy with putting out the fire, right? So you see, I have to be, you know, always alert and constantly engaged and recruit everything. And we're saying, well, you know, Mr. Brain, you're very stupid, you know, like say you don't know how to use the fingers for the fine motor skills. Effectively, this is the message that we get from the, you know, orthopedic and physical therapy community. They're saying, hey, this girl doesn't open her fingers. So what shall we do? We shall put a splint on her so that they would be in a better anatomical position. But the big question is, if we put a splint on her, how are we going to change the sequence? Are we going to help her in her respiratory condition, or are we risking some interference? Because this is something that we don't understand, right? So you see, there are so many elements that the brain has to put together in order to get this gas exchange going when the connective elements are significantly lost. So that's really the important thing to keep in mind, that when we are considering everything, that's the big thing. And when we look, you see, at this, it's not that she is just inflating her abdomen, right? You can clearly see for her that it's not just the abdomen, it obviously goes together with the neck, right? So you see, it's effectively she's doing this replacement for the non-functioning diaphragm, right? So you see, remember, we just seen these drawings here, which neatly and cleanly illustrated that the diaphragm somehow should be able to generate this precise, you know, contraction, and that nobody else is going to move together with it, that there will be stabilizers which are allowing this localized and isolated movement to happen, and it's the whole dome is going to have the right curvature and is going to have the right inclination, and so on and so forth. Well, it's a lot to ask, and for the people who have it, it's actually a huge bonus. It's a superstructure, super organization. It's not something which is just regular and normal and kind of local in that sense. You have to earn the locality, right? So you see, and the locality is being earned by that stabilizing globality. So that's what we have to keep in mind, right? So that the exclamation point, any movement, right? Any movement has to be like selective, isolated control movement, right? Isolated movement, that's only possible if everything else around this diaphragm and below and so on, if everything else is stabilized. So then you can have the luxury of the selective movement of the diaphragm. So that's really the big picture, and that's really the big thing for you to keep in mind. Bellows in the fireplace. Yes, thank you very much, Vivian, for bringing the timely considerations of this, of fixing the English glitches. So, and once we understand this, then we can move to the next part and say, okay, but what are the long-term solutions, right? So you see, what are the typical ways how the body optimizes, right? So let's do the first thing and look at it from the pictures which are showing us all the right things, right? So by the way, in order to keep the terminology clear, you see, the respiratory function requires at least two parts, right? The inlet and the outlet. So outlet is well known. It's associated with the diaphragm, right? Inlet is less well known thing, but here the two separate things are being put together. So if we look at it, inlet and outlet, these are functional names, not structural. Because when we say thorax, inlet of the thorax and outlet of the thorax, that's a huge bonus. See, once again, we look at this girl, what do we see? In her scenario, does the inlet and the outlet work this way? No. The abdomen is her outlet, and the mouth floor is her inlet. You know, we look at this girl. Her inlet is all the way, the shifting is the entire face is being the inlet of the whole thing. And when we move down here, see, the same story. She gets into this state of the outlet. Now it's not just the abdomen, right? So you see, we have observed the abdomen bulging forwards, right? But for her, this is a different story. Instead of getting deep, she is working in flattening. So her outlet is working towards the sides, right? So you see expanding and kind of taking her central line apart. So in order to make this understanding a bit more systematic, let's use the standard set of pictures. This is one of my favorite pictures, because this picture really shows things very well. So it's a great illustration for the types of the orientation. One, let's look here, right? So you see, looking at this, see, these are the external intercostals. You see how they're oriented? They are oriented like this, right? The other set are the internal intercostals. So they are oriented like this. And again, these angles, they are not precise. It's a general thing, right? It's a kind of, it's inclined that way or inclined that way. But it, of course, can change with it. So what does it give? That gives us a very obvious thing about the two basic types of the relationship between the chest and abdomen. So in that respect, as we look at it, we are going to see this. So if we look back at this girl, so what are we going to see? In her example, we're going to see the flat body, right? So her tendency is to get flat, but spread apart. So she spreads. She gets the hole in the middle, right? And what does it resemble to you? We just talked about the external intercostals and the internal intercostals, right? So that's the orientation of the internal intercostals. So the internal intercostals, they are setting the lead. That's a shell which is being activated and setting the lead for the total thing. Now, if we look at the other girl, what are we going to see there? So this girl is on her way for the fake depth. So for her, she will be more in the situation of getting the external intercostals as the lead mobilization, right? So you see, we remember that the body is in a desperate state of how to organize things, right? So for her, she's going to be bulging forwards, right? So she will be narrowing down and bulging forwards. That's the fake depth. So, and of course, there are variable combinations. As the child is smaller, those things are kind of clean, but then later on, you get some extremes which are being seen. For example, right? So you see, if we look here, so that will be the extreme example. So where what you are seeing, you are observing how the ribs, they have really bulged out, whilst the overall orientation for this girl is obviously spreading the legs, so she's flat. And once we look at this picture, what we have to understand, right? So you see, when we look at this picture, we understand that the total thing is tilted backwards. Everything is tilted backwards. Let's understand how it works. We look at this, right? Remember, right? So you see that's the external intercostals and the internal ones, right? And you see there is a third one, the innermost, the deepest intercostals. So that's what is not working, right? So you see that's where the straight typical orientation comes from. And they are required for stabilizing. But let's look at this picture. See, what are we going to do? We are going to flip this picture and tilt it this way, right? So what are you seeing here? You are seeing a typical situation, right? So that the diaphragm, even in the healthy person, it's slightly inclined, right? It's not just a dome that just sort of 100% across and looks downwards. So, and the top is inclined like this. So it's like these two inclinations. However, that sets the idea what would be if you are having the limits of the expansion at the top, or you can't drive it well enough through, like inhale it through. So what would you need? You would need a stronger pull from the other side, right? So you see, in other words, you try to use more abdomen to make the suction from a distance, like use a larger syringe to suck that air in. And in that sense, what we are having this other situation, that what would you do in order to get more out of the breathing? So obviously that will be expanding there, right? And making it in such a way that the diaphragm, instead of breathing down, would be open forwards. So there would be more space, better connection with the abdominal wall, so the abdominal wall can optimize. So that's why what we always experience is the tilt backwards. Whether it's a flat child or whether it's the fake depth child, the principal tilt is always the same, because it expands, it changes the situation for the diaphragm, right? But the combinations, they differ, right? Because if you were to draw the diaphragm, right, so you see it would be something which is like that. So it has two curvatures. So it's not one curvature, it's two curvatures, right? So you see, if we look at this, right, it's this dome, and this dome has two curvatures, and of course it has very specific attachments which go all the way to the back, the very specific attachments to the ribs and so on. So all of those factors, how well those attachments sit, they would be affecting the performance of the diaphragm and the active dynamic dome. But the general thing is that when the person is weaker and when he is using the abdominal wall more, you would be going towards the tilt. That's a general rule. So that's why this action, this pull, right, is being replaced, expansion at the top is being replaced by the additional room for the expansion at the bottom, all sorts of their reserves, right? So you see, because it has to be a total expansion, right? A total expansion. If the upper part doesn't expand well, what would you do? Logically, right, you would expand more at the bottom to create, to be able to create the same intensity of the inner drag, right? So, and that's why whenever we look at these situations, so this is what we have to keep in mind, right? So you see, when we look at this scenario, so this is the big tilt. Right, you can see here, these are the views from the different position, right? So you see, again, this girl originally is spread wide, but when spreading wide was not enough, then the secondary process which started was that fake depth thing. So that was intensification of the tilt. But you see, for her, you can see that even the arms, right? So you see, like everything, even the shoulder blades, they drive all the way in order to get at least some extra room on the top. So, and once again, I want to keep this idea in mind. The brain in the children with cerebral palsy, the brain is doing fine. The brain is clever, the brain is smart, the brain is providing the best possible solutions. It doesn't have the good execution, right? It doesn't have supports, it doesn't have the good constraints, doesn't have the good stability in the system. So it has to mobilize the superficial musculature in order to deliver the right kind of functions. So in that respect, we always have to look at it from that perspective, that it's always doing its best. It's always finding the right, the best solutions under the current circumstances. But again, in order for the brain to be able to control the freedoms, you need to have the good constraints. So that's our central message. Guys, it's not about the releases and so on. It's about if you have the good constraints, which are able to coordinate all these visible mechanical activities that are required even for the respiration, then you are in a good state. Then the respiratory drive itself is going to be a huge feed for the entire development. It would feed the development of the abdominal wall, it will feed the development of the pelvis, it will feed the development of the back, the arms and so on, and the brain would happily switch off this excess mobilization. So that's a very simple and the basic idea, right? So you see, when we are looking at the change and at the way how things evolve. So, and again, we know that ABR works well, right? And that we are able to get these transformations. So, I mean, I will show her ribs even like after a year of the Vibra work, right? So you see that is very spectacular. So that's like actually half a year later, you already could have seen that the rib situation became a lot less dramatic. I mean, I apologize for the, quality, the WhatsApp videos. That's, WhatsApp optimizes resolution so that it's the size, right? So, and you see the legs from being extremely spread as their neutral position. So where they were really like all the way out. So here we can see, like that's how the legs were spread, right? So you can see that even half a year later, the situation was improving. What we were doing, right? So we were just improving her stabilities, right? Improving her constraints. And as we move on, here we can look at some more examples, right? So you see here, this is the, continuation of the first example, but then look at this, right? So this is the example where this girl doesn't show much at the top, but is her situation better? It's different, right? So you see, for her, she needs to tilt. Well, again, we understood. What is she doing? She's creating the inlet. She's creating the inlet at the top and fusing it through the sides, right? And then it's the abdominal part which does her outlet. See, her neck is taking the expansion. Yes, so it's her neck. So her trachea moves less, but her neck bulges out. So if you keep in mind that all of those things, they are for the same thing, you need the inlet, which would be stabilizing, and you need the outlet, which is going to be providing the drag, right? So inlet, and it's a functional inlet, and it's a functional outlet. And it doesn't matter what it's going to be. So, and in that sense, your inlet is always where the air comes in, and then your outlet is all the way to the bottom, right? So if you can't stabilize those, so then you're going to show the true picture. So, and then, for her, she keeps the trachea, but then she has the expansion of the whole thing. And she kind of, her entire rib cage is fused, right? So you see, she is presenting a different case. So she's flattish and so on, but she is, she went the way of rigidifying it, right? Not getting so much of the shape change, but rigidifying. So her system has chosen for the rigidity rather than shape change. It's also a credible option, right? And you see the same story when we look at her. What we're observing, we're not observing much, right? We're not observing much of the activity. See, she's not really breathing there. She's just, getting that slide of the shoulder blades. And you see, when we look at, her from the side, do we see much of the range? No, we don't. Right, so you see everything here is very much fused. So she is regulating the whole thing just by this slight change of tension of the abdomen. But any other kind of expansions are not there. So, but for her, this is all her inlet. And that's a tiny outlet. So that's how she's working. And of course, if you see this outlet, right, so you see it's working forwards, it's not working downwards. That's the view from the back, again, showing that there's not, the slippery shoulder blades and so on. So there is no real life there and no real attachments. Again, why? Because, her breathing doesn't feed the development of the back. Now we look at this kid, right? So you see this kid is a kind of mix of another part, right? So you see this kid is replacing the clavicles with the pectorals. So again, that replacement gives him strange, but some sort of this upper part expansion. So that's his way. So that's why at the lower part, he is not that spread as the flat, as the full, like flat child would be. See, here he's not that spread, although his basic, direction is obviously, this lateral expansion of the ribs. But he has this interesting part here. But now, what does it mean? That means that his arms are obviously now servicing this replacement of the clavicles, where the upper string of the pectorals replace them. So he is using that as his form. The same story. If you were trying to do something for his arms, trying to stretch them, trying to put the, some some orthesis on it and so on, some even do the surgery or do the Botox injections, is it going to help? The answer is no, right? Because he is doing this for servicing his respiration, and the respiration is 24/7, 10 times a minute. So that's the important thing to keep in mind, right? That how large is the whole, how impactful is the entire respiratory thing. And you can see this is always a certain combination, but as long as you remember the two basic principles, that you need the inlet to stabilize, and you need some sources of expansion. They could be at the top or at the bottom, right? So you see this thing has to expand. And then you remember the basic layouts and the orientation of the diaphragm as the double dome. And you remember the basic layouts of the external and the internal intercostals. So you will see why the most typical basic types are the cases which are the external, which is that would be the fake depth child, right? So it's narrow and deep, with the chest looking more like the chicken chest, right? Like this chicken breast, pointy and very narrow abdomen, and very like that child would easily lie on the side, but would have huge troubles lying on the tummy or lying on the back, right? And you can have the child who is optimized over the internal intercostal. So this child would be flat, happily lying on the back, unless they have some challenges with the neck disconnect, right? But you can't really put them on the side because they would be just flipping. So these are the basic ideas of how the mechanism works. And then, of course, on top of this, this is either the child who chooses extreme softness, like squishiness, or it's then the build of the rigidity of the, you can get the, if you think about it as sort of cylinders, right? You can have the cylinder, which is like a cola can, just rigid, or you can have the one which would be sort of squashed like this, right? Or the one which would be squashed like that, right? So you see that will be two types of squashing. Let's see, this one I didn't draw very well, something like that, right? Yeah, not bad. Yes, that will do. So fake depth, fake width. So this is how the key mechanisms work. And, what do we do? What is my job in that sense, right? So you see, my job is to recognize this mix of patterns between the secondary rigidity or the primary instabilities, what are the constraints and so on, because obviously as the time goes by, those things, they pile up, right? So you see one on top of another and how they, influence one each other. And of course, like we already talked about the role of this system, which then translates into the reflux and so on, right? Because, obviously for both of those scenarios, with those tilts, the normal tensional control of the transversus abdominis and the, the ability to regulate the tone of the stomach itself is being affected. Plus, of course, the tilt itself creates a constant, the need for the drag, right? So you see that it's if you have a strong drag one way, need to pull in, so then upon its relaxation there's another drag which goes the other way, right? So these are the typical mixes that we face in these scenarios. And what else do I have here? Yes, so you see, and that's the kid from the side, right? So you see, that's where you can see that he is mixing the forms, right? So you see where he shows the fake depth, but he's not so pointy, right? As we can see it here. And this kid is the opposite, right? So you see this kid is very, very flat. So, and as we look at him from the side position is not something which is working well, right? So, and then you see also the part where, especially the hip surgeries, they translate into a lot of question marks, right? Because if the system used to work together with the abdominal wall and so on, and has been sort of forming slowly from the child being like young and little and then gradually increasing in size, then if you do something fast, dramatic and so on, and you fuse the hip, then your whole sequence changes, right? So then, and I keep reminding this basic point that yes, the problem of the hip that it has a lot of pain sensors, so it could be uncomfortable. That's a big minus about it. But on the other hand, the hip is designed to be like the vent. It's the last joint to be formed in the healthy people as well. So it's designed to be kind of discharging the tension. So being one of forms of our tail, right? So that's how the legs can work as the tail, discharge the tension from the torso. So that goes to the hip, and the hip kind of forms according to this, right? So of course, in a healthy child, that formation typically would happen by the age of 12, 18 months. But it's a process that we're discussing. If those processes, they haven't been shaped, so then if it's a 10-year-old child, his hip is still needed as the open thing, right? So you see, to discharge the tensions which are associated with the respiration and everything else. And when we fuse it, then we end up, and again, this is a girl from Norway with a full set, right? So you see, she has the button, she has the hip, and so on. So, and then things start twisting and distorting. So that's kind of the overall message, right? And the bigger picture always brings us back to the uniformity, right? So you see, this is our central message. Yes, we need to recognize these primary processes. What are the kind of specifics of the challenge, and what are the mixes that your child experiences? But fundamentally, we want to bring you back to this simple idea. At the end of the day, everything refers to the stability. It's the total thing, the total lining inside that has to be providing this base. And then this lining is integrated here, right? So you see, that is the total lining that you need in order to have the base so that things wouldn't float, that you are able to cool it down and create controllable tension instead of their less controllable changes in length. That's what the respiration is about. So that's why the global impacts, that's what we have to always keep in mind. And again, the good thing about the vibro and so on, that we have both there, right? So you see the local, regional and the global impact. However, when it comes to the positioning of the channel, when it comes to the wrappings and so on and so forth, so that's what you want to keep in mind, right? So you see it's a global setting, and it's the deficit of these global constraints which then forces the child into that survival 24/7 situation 10 times a minute when they can't change. It's like, okay, if this has been set at the beginning, situation cannot improve unless you start going back at the key stabilizers. So that's really the big picture. So again, we are completing our Facebook live participation, and then obviously it's going to be the recording. So, and as always, encourage you to make sure that you watch it again yourself, like it's a highly concentrated material. It takes worth your time to sort of start looking at the pictures, and not just as the observer, but as the person who would compare it with your own child and also listen to the assessments of your own child. So start putting this kind of pieces together. And of course, we really appreciate if you share this information with the other families and, let them understand the condition of their kids better. All right. Okay. So by saying goodbye to the Facebook users, and then we'll claim like 5 minutes break, and then we'll start the answers to the families.